thank you for the introduction. Thank you, everyone, for being here and for the great talk before. I just changed the slides a bit. So I went for this. Basically, without data, you are another person with an opinion, right? So we need to be really sure that whatever we are doing, we can measure that. So having metrics is kind of an essential piece of either you are a developer, you are a product owner, you are developing APIs, whatever you are doing in the world. Basically, metrics should be part of your decision process. So a bit of context. CEO of Vitergia, thank you, Lucas, for the intro. I'm part of the governing board of the Chaos community, that stands for Community Health Analytics for Open Source Software. So we are having discussions about what health means for open source communities, people that are developing software, right? And then I'm VP at the Inner Source Commons Foundation. That is about bringing open source good practices within the walls of large corporations, about breaking silos, sharing knowledge, fostering collaboration, which is perhaps one of the goals of APIs as well. When I'm trying to approach the APIs world, this is what I see. I see like a brilliant place. By the way, this is Hong Kong. I see like a brilliant place full of clouds that I don't understand, right? I'm trying to guess. I'm kind of new to this world. So if I say something wrong, please let me know on the one hand, and on the other hand, apologies in advance. So I'm quite new to this world. It happens that if you think of Hong Kong, you think of the previous slide, right? Really high skyscrapers and so on. But in reality, the island of Hong Kong is full of green. It's like a jungle. So if you see all of the green stuff around, that's the jungle. And it happens that the photo I see from APIs is basically that small square. This is pointing to those really high skyscrapers in the world, right? But then I typically wonder, okay, who's building those skyscrapers? How can I go to the place where the people that took the photo basically happened? Those buildings, who are they? How they are producing this, right? So I'm coming from a different world. My background is mainly in computer science and empirical software engineering. So basically, I'm interested in understanding who is doing what, when, and where. That's why the first talk by Lucas was really interesting to me, because then I said, okay, that's something that I understand. And that's basically the place. If you go to the downtown Hong Kong, to the Victoria Peak, this is where you can take the photo in case you go to Hong Kong at some point. Okay, so my question is, what's beyond APIs? And that's part of today's presentation. Hope it resonates in your minds. Let's have a look, right? Let's go together in this journey. Let me know if this works. Some thoughts. If I start thinking of APIs from a software engineering perspective or so, I think, are APIs a representation of the culture or the process of the company? So basically, are we having as many APIs as teams we have within the company? Are you having APIs inflation, what you call API soup? So is this kind of a representation of bad software engineering practices, the way we are exposing APIs either internally or externally? So that's perhaps part of the conversation. And the other question I had in my head is, can we improve APIs by improving basically some previous steps in the software engineering field? So velocity, stability of the software, or maybe enforcing other aspects as maybe the final service, or reliability, trustiness, maybe an SLA or so. So there are other questions that are around the APIs world that I might be interested in this. Of course, other questions that we may consider is the certain lack of internal collaboration, because that happens. We need an API to expose certain data sets or services. That might be a reason, because we are doing APIs and somehow Conway's law is kind of a representation of the way you are working internally with your teams. Basically, the architecture of your systems, perhaps the APIs, is a representation of that way of working internally. So that means that if you have teams that don't want to collaborate with each other, if you have teams that are working in an isolated way with certain budget and so on, with really strong ownership, maybe your APIs or maybe your final system will have that hierarchy represented in the architecture of your team. So that's basically what Conway's law is kind of saying. I feel that you may have a brilliant API front-end, but perhaps a poor software engineering process behind the scenes, right? And ideally, by having metrics about the software engineering process, what we'll get is about visibility beyond those APIs walls. So it's all about, those thoughts here that hope may make sense. The big disclaimer, I have a hammer, software engineering, cultural approach. So if I have hammer, everything, I see nails everywhere, so I can fix things with my hammer. So maybe this is not the right approach, but we'll see. Examples. Okay, let's think about our software development lifecycle. First of all, we have a feature request. Okay, we have maybe a new epic, maybe in Jira. Yeah, that's good. Of course, we are now splitting this into user stories, perhaps again in Jira. Then we have someone come in, we have a sprint, there is a pull request that is sent to GitHub at some point. Then we have a testing phase. I hope you have testing. Please have testing. This is running. Then we have a code review process. A human being is coming and saying, well, this is right, this is not. Well, you explain this tomorrow as well. There is certain ping-pong match here saying, things to improve. Suddenly there is a merge. Great, we have the code in the main branch. Then continuous integration, continuous deployment starts, perhaps with GitHub Actions. There are other tools out there, of course, GitLab and others. And then suddenly the new feature is available, and then we have external or internal community using this, perhaps not, as you said as well. Maybe that doesn't happen, and then there is information happening in Slack, in the forums, and some other places. So then if we split this in different ways, the left part is basically software engineering. It's about having those software engineering good practices. It's about enabling developers to effectively and efficiently produce code together, right? Collaboration and so on. Then there is a purely engineering phase, which is CI/CD, definitely, not that much about software engineering, perhaps. And then there is an outer world out there when the feature is available to everyone, either perhaps a new endpoint in an API, that, well, people start using that and consuming the information or so on and so forth. So yeah, software development lifecycle. So things that we could have into account. So basically, first of all, who is doing what, when, and where. If you're aware of when you are producing a commit, so a piece of code, and you upload that to whatever project, you are leaving certain traces of information, name, surname. You are leaving the time zone where you are, the time of the commit, you are leaving number of added lines, number of removed lines, the files that you were modifying. So there is a lot of information that is available out there when you are committing, just a piece of code. Now extend this to other areas: issue tracking system, code review processes, all of the continuous integration about stability and throughput. Probably you're aware of the Accelerate book. So there are many places where we can go for that information. So those are some questions that you may have from a software engineering perspective, and mostly from the community perspective, how your developers are producing code. So then you are then exposing your API, or maybe how others externally out there are producing code and consuming your API. So basically this is about the people that are producing code. Doesn't matter if this is for your API or consuming your API. So really quick, where is the data? We have Git repositories, we have GitHub, GitLab, Atlassian Stack, Bitbucket, Jira, Confluence, and others. We have Gerrit, which is a code review system, and where is the community participating at? So we were discussing about documentation and so on. So maybe it's Confluence, maybe it's Wiki, maybe Markdown files that are later transformed into HTML, and then people can consume the information. So we have wikis, Discourse, mailing list, IRC channels, Slack, So basically, you can gather all of this information and have a full overview of what's going on out there with your community, either internally or again externally. So you can gather data from all of them. Let's go to real life examples. Each dot that you can see here, I don't know if I have a small mouse around pointer. So each dot here, those are developers, okay? There is a connection between a dot and a blue square if that person committed a piece of code into that repository of information, right? A code repository, basically. So then we can build the network of your community, and we can build the network of your community that is producing code. These examples are coming from different open source communities because that's the information I have to illustrate, let's say, what I'm trying to share today. And then if you check what's going on in some of them, you see that there are really dense communities, like really continent communities, as we can see, for instance, in Chaos, perhaps OpenShift, perhaps Open Infra, but then you have some others at Wikimedia or the Johns Hopkins University that there are islands of developers. You have people that are producing code in an isolated way. So they are kind of small stars here and there. You have, certain participants that are producing things on their own with no, information coming from other developers from the outside. Is this happening in your API journey? Because if that's happening, that's telling me something, that from a cultural perspective, your developers don't want to collaborate with each other. Basically, what's happening there is that your developers are simply trying to fix the collaboration problem by exposing the data and please leave me alone, because I have other more important things to do. So that cultural approach might be, well, perhaps wrong. Some other examples, this is coming from the OpenFV project, which is networking, virtualization of networks. We have some companies on the left. On the top left, we have companies at Siemens, Canonical, Google, IBM, and others. And then we have some metrics. Number of commits, authors, touch lines, The point is that from an engineering perspective, there might be certain highlights, that things to improve specifically. If we go to the first one, we can see that there are commits. The average size of commit, you have some companies that are producing commit with 10 lines, 25 lines, but there are others, as in this case Deutsche Telekom, which are producing 1,000 lines for a commit. That's like a lot, right? So if you are doing a proper code review process, 1,000 lines, there is no human being that can basically review that activity. Doesn't make sense. So there's something wrong in the, from a good practice perspective, there's a lot to improve there. So at least we have a pointer and saying, hey, Deutsche Telekom people, what are you doing here? How is this working, right? And then the same with others, as maybe tracking issues with the average time open days and so on. So there are many ways of looking at the data. As there are companies around here that are kind of mentioned once and again. I was running some on-the-fly analysis for Backstage and Kong in this case. Well, this is about showing how live the community is. In this case, they're open source communities. So I went to github.com/backstage, github.com/Kong, and then I was doing some analysis. This is just people over time. So we can see, for instance, that in the case of Backstage, they had certain growth, and then they are kind of stable. In the case of Kong, they were kind of stable, and now they are growing a bit more. So then there are certainly differences from that community perspective and how people are developing software. This is another type of chart that you can gather, for instance, which is, okay, we have people that are producing code on top of our API, for instance. So for how long they've been participating in the community, for how long they are retained in my community, either again internally or externally. And then you can see that there are, depending on the community, there is certain tenure, certain experience for those developers that we can see. Example here, if we go for Backstage, for those people that were attracted 3 years ago, I don't know, 30 or 40, like just a few of them, like less than 10 or so, are still participating in the project. This is like the usual behavior in open source communities, by the way. In the case of Kong, numbers are quite similar, but this is kind of a demographics analysis, right? About my community, attraction and retention rate, for how long my developers can retain. So going back to the example of if my API, if my experience, developer experience is good enough, probably developers will be retained for a bit longer, right? So are specific aspects of my developer experience impacting the retention or the attraction of new developers? Well, maybe. Really quick, of course, we've been discussing a lot about metrics, but having metrics without certain strategy or structuring the information may not make sense. So first of all, and probably the main recommendation is don't have metrics because of the pleasure of having metrics, because it's easy to have metrics at some point. So be sure that you are aligning metrics to business goals. So whatever it's happening in either your community, your company, or so, from a qualitative perspective, from a quantitative perspective, from different ways, even if we are just discussing about API metrics from a purely perspective. Be sure that those are aligned with your business goals. And then ideally, from a methodology perspective, you can split those business goals into questions, divide and conquer. And then basically you go to smaller pieces of things, and then you go to the metrics. Okay, so if you follow this approach, probably the metrics will be really aligned with your business goals and chief level expectations and so on. Nothing new on the field. Have certain strategy, of course. So if you are defining certain policies or certain actions, please be sure that you are adding certain metrics strategy within your planification, because when you apply the policy, then you can check if that policy is currently working with metrics, and then of course you can act. You can rethink if that's working, or slightly modify the direction of wherever you are going. So some quick references. If you are interested in doing this at a scale, there is a Rebel Alliance report by the Mozilla Foundation, so you can have like a holistic approach of the whole Mozilla Foundation that happened years ago. So they were using, in this case, the tooling that I was presenting. That's one thing. Basically, you are able to visually describe everything. Again, from a network perspective, we were doing another analysis with Red Hat and CNCF community. We are talking about the level of thousands of developers, and basically who is who. You can scale your community management skills and so on. There is an academic paper in case you are into reading academic papers. That's something. Inner source metrics, I didn't mention that much about inner source, but you may have a really interesting question on the topic, so we can discuss later. Last but not least, if you want to run your own analysis from the more software engineering perspective, there are some open source tools and open source communities that are discussing about this. Chaos is one of them, Community Health Analytics for Open Source Software. Grimoire Lab is basically the tool that I've been using to gather all of this data. Cauldron.io is like the SaaS service if you want to try the technology for free and analyze your own open source projects. And then Vittorio Analytics, as I work for a company, we have commercial services on this. Inner source is this approach about breaking down silos, foster cultural approach, and enable developers to collaborate. So if you're considering how to move people into a more collaborative and transparent ways of thinking, please have a look at inner source. Might be something to consider. That's all I will say about inner source. Sorry. So if you remember this from the very beginning, then I would say this. Having data is cheap, so please have an opinion, okay? So be sure that whatever you are trying to do is, that makes sense at some point. So without an opinion, you're just probably another person with data. This is it. So thank you all for your time.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And I see the room has filled quite a bit.
Yep.
That's really nice. And I really liked your talk. And especially I think it's important that we combine these two things, like metrics about APIs, but also metrics about the communities that use the software and that work on the software. I think it's like really important to like understand the ecosystem to see this together. Does anyone have any questions for our speaker?
Yeah, I can go with this.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Could you turn the previous slide back?
Yeah.
It was a really good one.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, this guy, Edward, I mean, didn't say that, of course, but,
Yeah.
it works.